Everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I just wanted to just quickly say we're going to give about another minute for folks to join. We have, at last check, over 70 registrants, and right now we have about 37 participants in the meeting. So I just wanted to give an additional minute or two for folks to join if they're finishing up dinner. So we'll start in about 1 to 2 minutes. Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate you attending tonight's Science Cafe. Okay. Um, Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. My name is Timothy Davis. I'm the director for the Center for Great Lakes and Watershed Studies here at Bowling Green State University. And I'm happy to co-host these science cafes with my colleague, Dr. Kevin McClooney. This is the fourth in our series of science cafes. And for those who have participated previously, you've heard at least a previous rendition of this spiel. But for those of you who are new, science cafes were set up to be a mechanism for BGSU researchers working on water and watershed related research to give a overview of the work that we're doing here at the university to our community. Because the university and the community is so interconnected, letting the people that we interact with every day know about the research that's going on at the university and how we are trying to do what we can to help improve the water quality in the Great Lakes, as well as the watersheds that surround them, are very important to us. So science cafes are a partnership between the Center for Great Lakes and Watershed Studies and the Center for Public Impact here at the university, with support from WBGU, as well as the Division for Research and Economic Engagement. Now, before I introduce tonight's speaker, I just wanted to thank everyone who works very hard to make sure that these events are actually able to happen. So I'd like to thank V. Rosser, who's the director for the Center for Public Impact, as well as Esty Miller and Laura Mosler, who are also with that center. Esty works extremely hard, and she's the one who has been reaching out to everyone and giving everyone all the necessary information you needed to be here tonight. I'd like to thank Tom and everyone at WBGU for helping us set this up, as well as Maisie Davis and Alessia Saul, graduate students in the Department for Biological Sciences at BGSU, and also Peter Fairburn, who's our communications person, who has set up all the great flyers and informatics we use to promote tonight's event. So thank you everyone who has worked so hard to bring this together. Now, the way that these science cafes work, for those of you who are new, is that tonight's speaker is Dr. Chris Ward. He will give about a 20-minute presentation, and then we really want to open this up as a dialogue, right, between the attendees and the presenter. And tonight, Chris is going to have his graduate student, Fiona Harrington, join him on a panel afterwards. So you'll be able to interact with the scientists and ask questions. And we really want this to be a broad, open forum. You can either ask questions verbally or in the chat, and Dr. McClooney is going to moderate that discussion after the presentation. So with that, I am really pleased to introduce Dr. Chris Ward. Chris joined BGSU's Department for Biological Sciences. In 2019, he's also a member for the Center for Great Lakes and Watershed Studies. Before he came to BGSU, he obtained his PhD at Duke University Marine Lab, and he was a postdoc at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. He has some great experience. He grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, right on the Chesapeake Bay. And this is where he kind of really came to understand the beauty as well as the, how fragile aquatic ecosystems can be. And he is focusing his research on understanding ecosystem processes and finding ecology-inspired solutions to help protect and sustain them. So we're really fortunate to have Chris as a member of the center, and I'm really excited for the research that he is conducting and will conduct into the future. And from there, I'll turn it over to Chris and mute myself because I've done enough talking. And please welcome Chris, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
All right. Thank you, Tim, for the intro. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you again to the folks at WBGU and the Center for Public Impact. I'm really happy for the opportunity to share stuff about my research here with the larger community. So today I'm going to talk about algae's upside, or the benefits that algae can actually provide to society. And you might be surprised that algae could have benefits because you probably already know about harmful algae. Being close to Lake Erie and other lakes in the Ohio region, you're likely already aware that Lake Erie is regularly impacted by yearly harmful algal blooms, or otherwise abbreviated as Halves. And Halves occur in water bodies not just here in Ohio, but around the world. And some of these are natural. They occur, have occurred for millions of years, probably, but recently their frequency and intensity have been increasing, and the primary culprit of that is nutrient pollution. And so you can just see the satellite image. I can't see my cursor, but as you can see from the image on the upper right, that's Lake Erie, and the green swirls in the map are microcystis blooms. And the bottom image is just an aerial photo from an airplane flying over Lake Erie. You can see again, the swirls of green cyanobacteria. So given that, and what I think everybody grows up knowing about algae, is you think of it as almost inherently bad. So what upside could I be possibly talking about? And just for a second, I'm going to kind of put on my pseudo ethics hat. I'm clearly not an ethicist or a philosopher, but I just want to point out that algae is really not good or bad. They just are. They've evolved for millions of years to be very good at taking up nutrients in the water and growing. They use, again, nutrients and light to grow as much as they possibly can. So as I was just talking about, when there's an imbalance in the ecosystem and there's nutrient pollution coming in warm weather, they explode like we observe every year, pretty much every year in Lake Erie. But on the other hand, humans have found many valuable uses for algae. And you might already be aware of some. And so I'll just remind you all. But I'll also talk about a few that you might not be aware of. And before going too much further, I just want to take the opportunity to actually define what algae is. You would be it would be totally understandable to be a bit confused about what the term algae is, and that's because it is confusing. It's a catch-all term. Algae is a catch-all term that refers to aquatic organisms that use photosynthesis to live. In the image, so in this image, this is a cyanobacterium. In this case, it's a painting of Spirulina, but the other harmful algal bloom forming cyanobacteria in Lake Erie, such as Microcystis or Planktothrix, are examples of cyanobacteria. There are also these microscopic unicellular protists. Here's an example here of coccolithophore, but there are other kind of unicellular green algae. And then possibly even more notable or more recognizable just by eye are seaweeds. And so those are multicellular. Frequently they're misnamed or referred to as aquatic plants, but they're really actually a totally different organism altogether. So it is very difficult. Again, this is a catch-all term that includes quite a few different diverse organisms. And so algae are an incredibly important part of all marine and freshwater ecosystems. Because they act as the foundation of practically all aquatic food webs. And so this is just an illustration here where phytoplankton and seaweed provide all the sustenance for the animals in an aquatic ecosystem. And so all the material that they use comes from algae, and therefore that really underscores how important they are. And lastly, algae, as they're photosynthesizing, they're releasing significant amounts of oxygen, the oxygen that we breathe. And it's estimated that approximately 50% of all the world's oxygen is released by algae, with other 50%, of course, being terrestrial plants. So kind of just for this reason alone, algae are incredibly important, and we shouldn't think of them as all bad. But thinking about how humans use algae, you probably have actually used algae in several different ways today without even knowing it. And so examples of ways that we eat or use algae, probably most obviously is here with sushi, with the nori, or the dried seaweed wrap being actually made from an organism called Pyropia. If you haven't been to Kengo, you should check it out in Toledo. Hopefully this plug gets me some free food. But another example is Spirulina, which as we saw on the last slide is an example of a cyanobacterium, and that is used as a component of smoothies or drinks like Odwalla, the green superfood, or other things. They actually contain a lot of spirulina because they're really high in vitamins. And for this exact reason, some companies actually grow algae, this unicellular algae, that produce different pigments, different vitamins that are then turned into dietary supplements or even put into face creams. And that's because these pigments are vitamins. They're really, really high in antioxidant properties. It's been estimated that astaxanthin, which is this compound here, is about 10 to 100,000 times stronger than vitamin C. So really important for fighting off disease and staying young. But there are several other examples of compounds from algae like carrageenan that are used in other ways in personal care products like toothpaste or face cream, or even as a thickener or texture component in dairy and ice cream and even beer, and the list goes on. I definitely want to caution people from thinking about algae as sometimes on the internet you see that it's the new health fad or something, and I certainly I'm not trying to sell you on it. I don't own any stock options in algae companies. I just want to point out that algae has actually been around and been used by humans for many thousands of years. And so these are just a couple of historical examples of how here we have, these are of course modern images, but of Aztec communities and communities around Lake Chad, where they harvested spirulina from local lakes and then dried the material and incorporated it into their diet. And even today, communities near Lake Chad incorporate spirulina into about 70% of their diet. Again, because of the high vitamin, high protein contributions. And in another example, our seaweeds were also, for thousands of years, were harvested from the coast, were washed up on shore. They were harvested and then applied to farm fields near the coast. And they found that really improved the productivity significantly. And that was done across Europe, kind of along in France and Ireland and Nova Scotia, and along throughout North and South America for thousands of years. So those are just some examples of the historical uses, but it continues to, the potential for algae has even been explored by NASA. We're talking about space algae. So NASA has seriously been exploring the potential of using it, and even said that it would be essential for mission to Mars to grow algae in spacecraft or in space stations, because algae removes CO2 from the air and in its place releases oxygen. Of course, that would be important for the astronauts to live. And so this is a newspaper article from the 70s or 80s where a NASA researcher at the Jet Propulsion Lab created a self-contained, what he called an ecosphere, where finding a balance, using algae to create a balance between CO2 and oxygen. And this is a more recent image of an astronaut just a couple of years ago growing green algae known as Metacoccus up on, I believe, the International Space Station. But again, before we head to Mars, there are some very practical ways that we could apply the benefits and the potential of algae on Earth, where especially its ability to remove carbon dioxide and produce oxygen would be really critical. And so one of those examples is using algae to produce kind of a new age, a new generation of fuel produced by algae, and therefore constituting what's called a biofuel. And this is all made possible because many algae already naturally produce oils, and it's just kind of how their metabolism is rigged. And so the algae use sunlight to take up CO2 or carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then they just naturally turn it into oil and release oxygen at the same time. The algae producers would then grow up large football field size ponds of algae, harvest the algae and extract the algae oil, and then algae oil can then be converted chemically into biodiesel, and that sort of biofuel could be immediately used by current car and jet engines or generators, and there are actually some current examples of that in which just a few years ago this Diamond aircraft was the first flight that used pure algae biofuel to get up and stay in the air. So, and then on the other hand, just a few years ago, there's an initiative by the U.S. Navy to power their what became known as the Great Green Fleet, and so they were entirely fueled by renewable, carbon neutral biofuels. And from their standpoint, they view the dependence on foreign fossil fuel-based fuels as a matter of national security. So the ability to grow algae either in the United States, on land, or even possibly at sea would be a major benefit. And so the researchers there's already been major progress in producing algal biofuels, but there's still a lot to be figured out about it. And it's, as you might expect, it's not a simple process. It's not just as easy as growing algae in a pond or in Lake Erie, harvesting it and putting it into your gas tank. And I'll talk about kind of where it is in financially in just another slide. But in order to improve the process, that actually takes quite a bit. And part of that is finding the best algal strains, the ones that are best at growing to a high yield and producing the most amount of oil. So that's one component of the process. The second one, of course, you can think of algae as a crop that's grown, that's farmed. So understanding what the best growth conditions and the best cultivation schema or best ways of planting and harvesting, that's a really important part, and there are significant technological breakthroughs that have been done to make that possible. And then finally, there's the chemistry of extracting the oil and converting it into biodiesel. And again, I already kind of mentioned how this is very much like farming, and for most crops, we've had thousands of years to develop it, starting from the agricultural revolution in Mesopotamia to now. But all of this, figuring out how to grow algae and produce it into something that we can eat or put in our gas tank, has been compressed into just a couple decades. So imagine this as an agricultural revolution at turbo speed. And I do want to just kind of, in case you were about to run out to the gas pump, I just want to tap the brakes a little bit and point out that algae biofuel really remains considerably more expensive than fossil fuels. And there are a lot of complicated economic issues and that I will not get into. But I just want to point out that the gap in the expense is narrowing and will continue to narrow. It's projected to, so currently, or as of a year and a half ago when this report from the Department of Energy, Bioenergy Technology Office, when this was released, algae biofuels were, it cost, or is the equivalent of approximately, well, here it says 3.86 to basically $4 per gallon as of a year and a half ago. And they project within, by 2030, they project that it'll be down to about 2.3 or $2.30 to $2.50 per gallon. So now we're talking. That's competitive. But they actually do a really nice job of breaking this down into the different components where the costs come from. And you can see that the dark blue bar, which is the ponds and inoculum, or in other words, the cultivation of the algae, the growing of the algae, remains the most difficult and costly part of the whole process, which I just want to point out the irony of that, given that we're battling with algal blooms in Lake Erie and other places. That growing algae there is not the problem. But I'll get into why algal cultivation is an issue just a little bit. But while algae biofuels remain remains more expensive than fossil fuels, and therefore there's not a great market right now, as I mentioned before, there are some higher value bioproducts such as astaxanthin and other pigments and dietary supplements that are a better option and are quite marketable and financially feasible right now. And so a lot of the lessons learned from producing those biofuels, getting algae to grow well for those purposes, are being applied to and translated into growing biofuels more productively. So now that I kind of spread the pro-algae propaganda, I want to now pivot to talking about what we're doing here at BGSU in order to improve algal growth. And as I was saying in the last slide, the algal cultivation component of the whole process is the trickiest, the most costly, the real roadblock to really cracking this. And so the focus of my lab is to figure out how to grow algae better. And since I have a background in ecology, our approach to it is studying the ecosystem within the algal pond. And what I mean by that is that an algal pond, while it is primarily algal cells, there's a whole ecosystem within that. There are especially these other microorganisms, bacteria and fungi, that are growing in concert with the algae. And you might already be familiar with the term microbiome, because that's a really important topic. There's a lot of buzz, and it's because human microbiomes is really important for how human physiology, human health functions. So, and the same thing is true for algae, same thing is true for plants. So there are the other organisms that are growing in the algal pond have a significant impact on the productivity, on the growth, on how much we can produce in a pond. And part of that, a large part of that, are these kind of helper bacteria that grow and help the algae grow because they're providing them with important vitamins or precursors. And on the other hand, as algae is a crop, there are always these pests and predators and parasites that come into the ponds and can be very harmful or deleterious to the growth. And so both of those, both the helper bacteria and the pests are a big focus of our lab's work. And then since coming to BGSU, I'm also really interested in what other beneficial applications of algal growth can we find? And can we pair those with either algal biofuel production or such? And we'll get into some more details on this, but how can we grow algae to actually remediate or remove nutrients from wastewater? And while we're doing that, can we either produce algal biofuels or produce fish feed or fertilizer that we can apply back to the farm fields where the nutrients came from originally? So just to talk a little bit about some more about the pest issue, I'm going to talk about some of the work that I did during my postdoc, but also that my master's student Fiona Harrian has been working on at BGSU. And so we're really trying to understand, in order to protect algal crops, we're trying to understand the ecology behind the parasites and how they're responding to various factors in the algae ponds. And so a particularly harmful pest is there are these parasitic fungi that turns out they're pretty much in every natural lake or ocean or water body, and they're just naturally part of the community. But when they come into these algal ponds that are entirely, or there's only one strain of algae in these ponds, if the parasites can target or infect that algal strain, they can completely wipe out the pond within a matter of days. And so this is just an example here where we have still a healthy pond on the right that's nice and green, but there was an infection, and then like 2 days later it turned from green to kind of a muddy color. And so that's when this happens, basically lose the entire crop. And so understandably that dramatically increases the production cost, because you put all the upfront costs into nutrients and everything else, and you get nothing for it. So this is a big issue, both for the production of algal biofuels as well as the production of those dietary supplements like astaxanthin. And so with the funding of the US Department of Energy, we're trying to understand both how these parasitic fungi, how they actually go about infecting the algae. That's surprisingly not known. But also what factors are influencing the infectivity of the fungi. And so if we can understand those and resolve those factors, then we want to then take that knowledge and develop novel treatments and ways to mitigate the impact of these pests. And this is just an illustration of the infection process. And one thing that we found, so this is an illustration of the infective part, where these parasitic fungi kind of identify the algae, and at a certain point, they just latch onto the outside and kind of through a straw or a syringe, they just suck out the insides. And you're left with these ghost cells that are completely empty. So not valuable. But we found through the experiments that there's actually a whole nother lifestyle where the fungi can grow in a non-infective way. And so if we can figure out what causes that switch, maybe we can find treatments to steer it in that direction and keep it in that direction. so we're not having those negative impacts to the cost of the algae. And then as I mentioned earlier, we're also trying to find out if there are ways to use algae to fight nutrient pollution. Of course, this is a big issue here at Lake Erie and all around the world. And as I've talked about before, the algae, of course, are very good at taking up nutrients and growing and multiplying. And so our thought is, if we can grow algae in a controlled way, kind of in these engineered systems, can we take the nutrient waste from either from livestock or agricultural runoffs, or turns out a big waste source in some areas are breweries. So can we take those waste sources, run them through an algal pond where we produce a lot of algae, takes up the nutrients into the algae, and then the waste is no longer going downstream into Lake Erie and causing an algal bloom. And so in my brain, I think that would be a win-win, or maybe a win-win-win, because we're reducing the nutrients, making a cheaper way for farmers to dispose of their waste. You're producing algae that can be converted into biofuels or fish feed, and then we're also mitigating the algal blooms in Lake Erie. And so when I started here, shortly before COVID, I had this kind of that nugget of an idea, but once we were kind of temporarily moved out of the lab, we were trying to find out if there were ways that we could do research with algae out of the lab and with easily obtainable supplies. And so that brought about this kind of fun project where we actually assembled these algal growth systems using, as you can probably make out from the image, mason jars and grow light from Home Depot and aquarium tubing from the pet store. This was initially done in order for a high school student, actually at my high school alma mater in Baltimore, at Baltimore Polytechnic Institute. She was working on completing a research practicum. And so in our remote work from home world, she was able to set up this home system, and she's been working on answering these really interesting questions of whether these algal polycultures or with these cultures with multiple strains of algae, whether they're better at removing nutrients than just a single culture or a single strain on its own. And then also comparing isolates or algae that are from, say, a Baltimore stream versus one that was isolated from Arizona or Hawaii. And so she has her own system set up in her basement, and she's been working through this. And it's been really, really fantastic to see how she is kind of empowered to come up with new ideas, do new research. And so kind of based on that, we started thinking about how we could make this available for classrooms around the country, whether it's for class activities for K through 12 teachers or for science fair projects for students. So we're currently putting together a website to make all of our designs and protocols available. We haven't launched the website yet, but in the meantime, if any teachers or students are interested in setting up a system, please email me. You can either see my email on the screen or find me through the BGSU website. I'd be happy to share all the resources that we have. And that wraps up what I wanted to share. I just want to say again, thanks to everybody for joining the Science Cafe tonight. And again, thanks to the Center for Public Impact and the Center for Great Lakes and Watershed Studies for putting on this series. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was wonderful. Let's everyone thank him for his presentation. So I am Kevin McLooney. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at BGSU, and I'll be hosting the Q&A session, so the discussion session. A few quick things. So raise your hand if you have a question, your digital hand. So there's a way to do that. If you go and look, if you click on the participants window, if you have it on the computer, you should be able to see your hand. If you're on another electronic device, it might be elsewhere, but there's a way to raise your digital hand. And then you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask your question. Or you can send your question via the Zoom chat box directly to me, or to the whole group is fine as well. Either way, and I can read it out to Chris, and also have a panelist. So Chris, do you want to introduce the panelist?
Yeah. So tonight, my master's student, Fiona Hurian, is joining us, and I'll give her all the hard questions. But yeah, thanks, Fiona, for joining tonight.
Great. So do we have any questions? So you can raise your hand. I have one used to get us started, and this would be maybe for all the panelists, but Chris can start. Did you love science as a kid? What about biology? Did you know it could be a career? If not, when did you realize that?
Yeah, no, I definitely, I was always interested in biology through school. I was always fascinated about it, but yeah, I never thought that it could be a career besides being a doctor or a nurse. And it wasn't until college where I had the great opportunity to work in labs and see that scientists weren't just kind of this caricature that you see in like Back to the Future or other movies. And while scientists can be kooky, but it is a real career. And so, but yeah, once I started working in a lab and seeing kind of the lifestyle and the sense of community in labs, I was really hooked. And yeah, and it's been a fun journey, and it continues to be a great community here at BGSU as well in the biology department.
Awesome, thanks, Chris. Fiona, do you have a similar or different answer? It's always fun to see different people's stories as they learned about science and that they could do this as a career.
Yeah, so I actually, from being a really small child, I always really wanted to be an astronaut. I guess the dream could still be alive every day. I feel like there's more interesting news about space and making space accessible to more than just astronauts. But yeah, that's what I really wanted to do as a kid. And then eventually I realized that maybe that would be a bit of an ambitious dream. So then I always have really loved being outside and just like learning in general. And somehow I just kind of took a class in high school taught by this really cool, I think she was an immunologist, and she taught us about reading journal articles and doing research and talking to scientists that were either like professors or working in institutions. And that was a really important experience for me, because I hadn't ever conceived of, except for being an astronaut, what a scientist would be like or working in science. So I'm so glad I had that experience. And then, yeah, throughout high school, I was set on doing some sort of biology. So yeah, basically I went to undergrad. I was sure I was going to be a biology major. And then I had some really cool microbiology experiences during my summers as an undergrad that really cemented my love for microbes and a great ecology professor. So that's how I ended up doing microbial ecology. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I think few people start out from an early age thinking, I just really love microbes, right? But they get there eventually. It's cool stuff. So we've got some questions in the chat. First one, do the species of algae in Halves produce enough oils to be used as biodiesel?
I think thank you. The short answer is no. But yeah, sorry. I think the short answer is no. There are a number of other really interesting compounds or metabolites that are produced by harmful algal bloom species, and I think there's some really great work that's being done by researchers. Some of the researchers like Tim Davis and George Bullershon are involved in this work, but I think it's led by researchers up at University of Michigan and Wayne State that are doing the chemistry. So we should get them to come and share more about that.
Cool. This is kind of a related question, but could the strains of algae that are harvested for biofuel be seeded into areas of high nutrient loading to siphon nutrients from algae, from the harmful algae?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way it would be, if you seed it, it would then be hard to retrieve it. So that's kind of why I like the idea of having kind of these engineered systems where you might they might be on land, or they might be on floating platforms in the lakes, but where you you have them separated, and you can flow the high nutrient water through, either kind of from a waste source through this algae scrubber, where it scrubs the nutrients out, and then you take the clean water and let it go downstream. And that way it's already contained, and it's much easier to control, and you're also, I guess, I also am always concerned about interfering too much with natural processes, which kind of seems, I'm just always worried about unintended consequences of trying to seed populations in places that they aren't naturally currently. But that's a complicated, it's a ball of yarn that's hard to fully untangle.
Cool. So here's another one. You may or may not know the answer off the top of your head. Maybe Fiona, that's yours. How much land is needed to produce a gallon of algae-derived biodiesel compared to alternatives like soy-derived?
That is a fantastic question, and I don't know at all. This feels like my prelim all over again. No, that is a great question, and would be worth exploring the literature on that.
Fiona, quick, Google it.
Well, yeah, I actually don't know the answer to that exactly either, but something that has to be said, though, is that since algae are much smaller than plants that would be normally used for biofuel, there is at least that advantage, but I don't know the answer, sorry.
Yeah, and so I do know that in places like Arizona, Texas, Southern California, where algae is frequently grown because it's in the sun belt, so a lot of sun, as opposed to kind of here in Toledo or up in Toledo. That's a lot of it's a lot of land that is not in circulation, is not being used to farm. You do have to get the water there, but you're not competing for you're not competing directly with these other more conventional crops.
Cool. Sorry, moving around a little bit. Are there strains of algae which could be used in bioremediation of petrochemicals like there are for fungi?
I'm not aware of any. There probably are. There's such a diversity in all microbes, but yeah, though. Yeah, I'm more aware of the fungal strains and the bacterial strains that break down hydrocarbons. But yeah, I don't want to put it past evolution to have made an algal strain or some algal strains that can break down oil.
They're pretty amazing. I would, yeah. Biology, there's always some exception out there too, right? So it'd be fun to look at. Okay, so next question. Are there any other pathogens besides fungi, or like the chytrids you were talking about? Are there any other pathogens?
Oh, yes. Chytrids are just the tip of the iceberg. There are, endless numbers of bacterial pathogens that infect algae. There are actually some cyanobacterial pathogens of cholera, of chlorella, which is a green algae. They're called Vampirovibrio, which is I like because it's a colorful name, and they just kind of come in and suck out the blood or the algae oils. And yeah, there are a lot of algal viruses and other non-photosynthetic protists, all that infect different types of algal strains. So it can kind of feel like a whack-a-mole when you figure out how to protect the algae from one thing, it then becomes susceptible to other ones, and you always have to, as you're developing new strains, you have to then look to see what the new strain is susceptible to. But I think that might also, part of that is it's obvious to people who study natural ecosystems and how microbes interact in natural ecosystems. Kind of everybody, or all microbes are always either, there are a lot of microbes that are either killing some other microbe or being killed by other microbes. But also on the other hand, if you kind of think of algal crops as agricultural crops, anytime that you plant a monoculture, you're going to be very susceptible to pests coming in and wiping out your entire crop. So thinking about some of the newer approaches to terrestrial agriculture of planting mixed crops, so you're a little less susceptible. That approach has been borrowed and taken into algal cultures. And we touched briefly on algal polycultures, of having multiple strains in there. So if one strain gets infected, you still have 4 other strains that are able to grow. That are just a couple of approaches to battle pests in algal cultivation.
Really cool. It's like integrated pest management for biofuels.
Exactly.
Nice. Next question. How cleanly do these algal biofuels burn?
I don't know how to answer that. I don't know anything. I am not a. I think that I don't know that much about the emissions, the impurities of fossil fuels, but there are a lot of NOx and SOx emissions. I think that is something that is kind of specific to fossil fuels. I would not anticipate that being in algal biofuels. Yeah, I haven't actually explored that component of it, and yeah, most of the work that I have been focusing on is really upstream of the actual oil product. So, but it's really interesting to explore, and thinking about kind of the balance also of like how much, an important part of the emissions is also the CO2 that's released, and a big advantage of algal biofuels that I didn't touch on directly, but again, to produce algal biofuel, you're removing CO2 from the system to produce the oil, and then sure, when you burn it, you're releasing it back into the atmosphere. So you're at least in theory carbon neutral, whereas fossil fuels, you're just unlocking it from the ground and putting it into the atmosphere.
Cool. Next question, is there a type of algae that's most suitable to be used as biofuel? If so, what makes it better than the others?
Yeah, there's not a single algal strain that is the best. Different algae grow better under different conditions. So part of that is part of it is if you are located in a certain part of Southern California, you might find one biofuel or one algal strain grows better there than a facility that's growing it in Florida. So some of it is just how well they grow under those conditions, whether light intensity, temperature. If you're growing them in salt water versus fresh water, but the kind of exploration or bioprospecting for new algal strains is kind of this continuing process, and I feel like every time that I go to a Department of Energy conference, there are kind of a new list of the most promising strains, and some of them are like, sometimes you have a huge jump in productivity, and other times it's just kind of like slowly improving upon the last ones. Yeah, it's a continuing effort to find ones that grow well and produce more fuel or produce other high value compounds. But certainly, yeah, so far there's not one strain that wipes all of them off. So it and I think it's good that there are many strains that can be grown in different environments.
Great. So we have one that they are really fascinated by this idea of using algae for nutrient removal in ag runoff specifically. What might a system like that look like?
So there are quite a few systems that already exist and that could be either modified or some of them could probably, some of the ones that are being run already by industry could be kind of plugged in immediately. But yeah, primarily, so algae can be grown totally just from light and CO2 from the air, but then there are some algae can also actually grow on sugars or other organic matter, and so depending on what the waste is, some strains could actually some algal strains can actually grow in the dark. How exactly the setup would work is going to be dependent on where you're trying to implement this. If you live if your facility is somewhere that has a lot of light and you can do this, you could potentially set it up on the side of a field. If you have ditches that don't, where you're not growing stuff, you could have kind of an elevated pond. There are even some kind of look like very large gutters where you just kind of pump the water up, then let it naturally go down with gravity, and the algae will just naturally colonize that gutter, and you can come in every couple days and just scrape it up with like a squeegee, or in some cases they use like snow shovels. It grows so quickly. Yeah, it's the combination of nutrients and sunlight that are really important. But on the other hand, if you are generating waste in the winter, it's not going to work too well to put that out, especially if we have snowstorms like we had in the past couple of weeks. But yeah, if you have a warm area, a little bit of added like grow light, you could grow the algae indoors and produce biomass and mitigate your nutrients. Yeah, it would be. There are a lot of different configurations that people have been exploring, and it's fun just to kind of see what people think of at conferences or just looking around the internet to see what people are kind of showcasing.
Wonderful. Well, I think we will officially end it there. I want to thank everyone for coming and thank all of our campus partners that Tim thanked at the beginning. Again, also thank you to Dr. Ward and Fiona. And there are going to be some ways to continue to stay engaged. There's going to be an event evaluation survey after the event. And of course, we have a lineup of speakers for the next few months. And so we're going to look for the emails and communications about the future activities and events. And Tim, did you have any final words?
No, just thank you again, everyone. And thank you, Chris and Fiona. This has been fantastic. We really appreciate, all the work that you're doing and the time you took tonight to speak with us about it.
It was really fun.
Thanks everyone
Thanks
for coming.
All right. Good night, everyone. Thanks again.
Take care. Chris, I'm saving the chat for you.
Oh, thank you.
So you can have it for later. All right, take care, everyone.
Thanks, Kevin.